The following presentation is from PBS Home Video.
Innovative programs, challenging concepts, and quality family entertainment. This is the world of PBS Home Video. New critically acclaimed programs are now available at prices that make it affordable to add PBS Home Video to your permanent collection. Through it all, you'll discover quality programs that your family will enjoy for years to come. PBS Home Video, bringing the world alive with award-winning programs guaranteed to change the way you look at home entertainment.
To order videotapes using your Visa or MasterCard, or to receive a free PBS Home Video catalog, call 1-800-538-5856.
Frontline is a presentation of the Documentary Consortium.
New evidence on the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
He said, "Did you hear the good news? They shot the son of a bitch. They killed the son of a bitch."
Correspondent Jack Newfield examines the revelations of former mob lawyer Frank Regano about the possible role of the mafia and Jimmy Hoffa.
And he ranted and raved for a while about this goddamn Kennedy, and they just got to get rid of John Kennedy. I think he used the word kill even. So we were celebrating his assassination of the president.
I was horrified, absolutely horrified, hearing the two of them toast to that assassination.
JFK, Hoffa, and the mob.
With funding provided by the financial support of viewers like you and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is Frontline.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
As America watched the inauguration of John F. Kennedy on January 20th, 1961, the Mafia was watching too, watching with confidence and with apprehension. Part of the mob had joined in the vast coalition which had elected Kennedy. A few were even friends with his father.
So help you God.
So help me God.
But John Kennedy had appointed his brother Robert as Attorney General, and Robert made it clear that gang-busting would be his top priority.
Mr. Kennedy, do you expect to delve into any particular fields when you take over as Attorney General?
Well, I think that there are a number of different areas and where action is needed. I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's in a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time.
Before the Kennedys, the mob had literally been getting away with murder.
The glory years for the mob were right after the Second World War, right up to 1960. That was it.
Nick Pileggi has written about the mob for 30 years and was co-author of the movie Goodfellas.
They owned politicians, they owned unions, they could actually socialize. The FBI said they didn't exist. I mean, it was unbelievable, it was glorious.
Now, would you explain what evading a place means?
Well, if you're
Jack and Robert Kennedy had studied the mob since 1957, when they took the lead on the McClellan Committee's investigation of organized crime and its association with organized labor. They focused on Jimmy Hoffa, president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the largest union in the country. They were quick to clash.
I would like to say, Senator, that if you're trying to penalize the American labor movement for Hoffa, or for your dislike for Hoffa, then spell it out in the law, exempting everybody except Hoffa. Will you please?
Well, we're exempting everyone but racketeers and hoodlums and crooks.
I would like to have you draft that language, sir.
I'm not talking necessarily...
As Attorney General, Robert Kennedy was determined to convert his knowledge of the mob into a new national policy. Don't define it, do something about it, he told the young lawyers he recruited for this mission. Robert Blakey was one of those lawyers.
You just can't know how inefficient and complicated and inept the government is unless it's held together in some way by the force of somebody's personality. Robert Kennedy had that and did that.
He forced FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to shift manpower and resources away from hunting communists to busting gangsters. He surfaced mob informant Joe Valachi in a nationally televised hearing.
Then he picks your finger. Who? The Godfather.
He picks your finger.
He picks your finger with a needle. Makes a little blood come out. In other words, that's the express, the blood relation. Supposed to be like brothers.
That's the letting of blood.
That's right.
All of us in that position.
Under Robert Kennedy, successful prosecutions of organized crime figures increased 700%. He assigned 20 prosecutors to focus solely on the Teamsters Union and Jimmy Hoffa's ties to the mob.
He had connections to the New York mob, he had connections to the Detroit mob, to Cleveland, to Kansas City. They were different lawyers, different middlemen. In this case, with the two organized crime families in the South, major families, it was Frank Regano. He was part of the team that would defend Hoffa in these various trials. But he was the one who Hoffa spoke to on personal matters. And those personal matters dealt exclusively with the two organized crime bosses in Tampa and New Orleans.
Is it fair to say you loved Jimmy Hoffa?
Yes, I did. I loved him for many reasons, and warts and all, I loved him. And I was aware of all the warts. I was aware of the kickbacks. Nevertheless, I loved him because he was my kind of guy. He wore his feelings on his sleeve. You could tell where he stood at all times. And he was straightforward. And I like that sort of person, I suppose, because in many ways I'm that way.
I met with Frank Regano earlier this year in Tampa, Florida. He told me that he would reveal his full story as counsel to Hoffa and the mob for the first time. My goal was to test his credibility and to check out his story. He's an unusual eyewitness to some dark secrets of American history, including the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, the CIA mafia plots to kill Fidel Castro, and the assassination of President Kennedy.
I'm privy to a lot of things that happened that's part of history. My parents came to this country, migrated to this country from Sicily. This country's been very good to me. I've been very fortunate. I was able to become a very successful defense lawyer, and I owe this country something.
To understand Frank Regano's secrets, you have to first understand how he came to be connected to the mob. His childhood was normal enough. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Tampa. But he told me a story that sounded like it had come straight out of The Godfather.
When I was a child, about 9 or 10 years of age, I had an older sister, my oldest sister, and her name is and was Rose. And she had a husband who physically abused her, something terrible. And so on one occasion, I was playing underneath the table. And my mother said to my father words to the effect that, sooner or later, he's going to kill her. Just a matter of time. And I think it's time you go see the man.
Regano's father made a call to a mysterious, all-powerful mafia figure who had the son-in-law's arms and legs broken.
I suppose subconsciously I had a certain feeling about the mafia because of what Perhaps it saved my sister's life.
Of indebtedness? Or
I suppose so,
affection?
yes. Not affection, really, but perhaps some respect.
With that kind of childhood memory of benevolent terrorism, Regano had no inhibition to becoming a lawyer with mob clients. He denies that he actually became a made member of the mafia and insists that he had many other prominent clients. But his most lucrative were Hoffa and Santo Trafficante Jr., head of the mob in Tampa. Trafficante was one of the most cunning and ruthless bosses in the history of the mob. Regano met Trafficante in 1954, and he often socialized with him here on the island of Cuba. Cuba before Castro was a gangster's paradise. Mobsters and celebrities alike flocked to this Caribbean hotspot, and Regano often took along his movie camera.
What was the life like in Cuba before the revolution, when you would go down in '57?
I felt invincible. I had all that power behind me. I could accomplish anything. Nothing was impossible. And it was almost, the only way you can describe it is almost magical. They could open all sorts of doors and make almost anything possible. My wish was their command.
The mob controlled more than a dozen casinos, and in exchange, let the island's dictator, Fulgencio Batista, skim casino profits. The Mafia's executive committee selected Maya Lansky of Miami and Santo Trafficante of Tampa to manage their cash cow. The mob trusted Trafficante to practice honor among thieves and give each family their fair share.
When he was a power in Cuba, he, to a great degree, ran Cuba. He was very intimately involved with the ruling powers in Cuba. And as a result, he didn't have the kind of paranoia of the government looking at what he was doing all the time.
But in 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution threatened the operation of the casinos. The mob hedged its bets, supporting both sides of the conflict. Frank Sturgis, who would later become famous as a Watergate burglar, was Castro's man in charge of the casinos.
What did Trafficante do covertly to help Castro when he was a revolutionary in the mountains?
Give money to the underground, which he had many of the people of the underground working for him. See, this is what he did. He supported them financially.
After Castro took power, the future of the casinos was in doubt. The mob tried to keep Castro pleased. One casino donated a tractor to help agrarian reform. At one point, even Jimmy Hoffa got involved.
After Castro's victory on New Year's Day, 1959, Hoffa began negotiating a Teamsters pension fund loan for a group of businessmen out of Ohio and Arizona for the purposes of sending a fleet of C-74 Globemaster aircraft to the new Cuban government. And this was going to be paid for in part by a Teamster pension fund loan, about $300,000-400,000. In April of 1959, Castro double-crossed the mob, so to speak.
All of a sudden, the order came down, close all the casinos in Cuba. And all the casinos in Cuba were closed. My people went over and says, hey, you're closed up.
He exiles Carlos Marcello from Cuba, sends him back to New Orleans. Meyer Lansky flees the island, and Santos Trafficante is placed under arrest and imprisoned.
Regano says he helped get Trafficante safely out of Cuba.
And they were going to execute him. They were going to put him before the firing squad. And I went down there and I met with the Attorney General. And as a result of that meeting, Santo was allowed to leave there.
How much did you have to pay?
I don't know that. I'm sure something was paid, but I have no idea what was paid. But I'm sure it cost a great deal.
Unknown to Regano, a gun runner by the name of Jack Ruby came into Cuba during this time. And according to documents and congressional testimony revealed years later, he met with Traficante in jail. At the same time, Ruby offered bribes to the Cubans to get people out of prison. Angered at being thrown out of Cuba, the Mafia wanted to kill Castro. So did the CIA. They went to the mob for help. Because of his Cuban connections, the agency tried to recruit Traficante. But according to Regano, Traficante believed it was impossible to assassinate Castro without getting killed in the process. So he decided to just play along with the CIA.
It was just a big scam. There's no intention, no effort whatsoever, or any attempt made to assassinate Fidel Castro.
I mean, Santo had lost millions of dollars in investments and holdings in the revolution, but he didn't want to think he could get back?
No. He was very realistic, very philosophical about that. He thought that was a lost cause, especially after the Bay of Pigs. Santo was wise and clever beyond belief.
In 1978, Traficante was subpoenaed to testify about the CIA mafia plots before a congressional committee. It was a rare opportunity to see the mobster in public, but he had shrewdly made a special request to the committee.
The witness having requested that he not be subjected to radio, television, or photographic coverage, the committee directs that all lenses be covered and that all microphones used for coverage be turned off at this time.
After a full day's testimony, Traficante emerged without comment to the press.
Did he tell the truth about the plots to kill Castro?
No, he lied to the committee.
How do you know that?
He told me he did. I was not representing him at that time, but he told them what they wanted to hear.
Which was what?
That they were really attempting to assassinate Fidel Castro, and there was no such attempt made. There was a pretense, but not any attempt.
You're saying Santo scammed the agency?
Yes, of course, yes. And he said, I told him what they wanted to hear, but one of the things I'll never forget what he told me about this. He said, yeah, he says, I remember when I was a kid going to school, I would read those history books, and I would listen to those history teachers, and I believed all of that. I didn't think people would lie about history. He said, it's a lot of bullshit. He said, I just made history, and I lied.
The mafia scam of the CIA was a story Traficante would not tell Regano until some years later. In the early 1960s, trust was just building between the mobster and his lawyer. Regano's efforts to get Traficante out of Cuba had solidified their friendship, and Regano was surprised to learn that their fathers had known each other.
He said, I guess you know my father helped your father some years ago. And I didn't know what he was talking about. I had no idea what he was talking about. He said, you know what I'm talking about? He said, your sister. Remember your sister? Her husband was beating her? Well, my father put a stop to that. And then, for the first time, I realized who my father had been to say.
The good times continued to roll for Frank Regano. From the beginning, he overstepped the boundary between lawyers and their mob clients by often socializing with Traficante. Regano's wife, Nancy, often joined them.
I had been with Santo and Frank many times for dinner. The man was an absolutely perfect gentleman. I liked him. I liked him an awful lot. He was well-read. He spoke to me in very, very kind terms. Very polite, low-key person.
Traficante was a godfather's godfather. His father had been a mob boss. In his 20s, Santo Jr. was sent to New York to be an apprentice under mafia boss Carlo Gambino.
Traficante had been raised as a mob prince. He had a sense of well-being. He had a sense of dignity. And so you could see right away that here was a man who didn't, who had a sense of his own worth and wasn't running from people and wasn't running from anything. That gave him tremendous power. It also meant that he was totally housebroken as a social being. And it would have been easy for a lawyer like a Frank Regano to deal and act socially with Santo Trafficante. Trafficante wasn't hanging around a mob social club where, you know, all they did was punch each other in the arms and curse. He was a totally different kind of culture, totally different kind of being. And I think that helped in the seduction, albeit unwitting, but in the seduction of Frank Regano into that world.
But there was a more sinister side to Santo Trafficante.
For all the panache, for all of the style, for all the sophistication, this man, of course, ordered murders. Many murders. I mean, he was, in the end, under all that style, a butcher.
Trafficante told Regano that he wanted to do business with Jimmy Hoffa, but he wanted to be able to testify truthfully that he had never met Hoffa if he were ever called in front of a grand jury. So he asked Regano to serve as intermediary.
I don't know that I was the appointed messenger, but it just turned out that way. So whenever I would see Santo, and he knew I'd just left Jimmy, of course, we didn't call him Jimmy, we called him Marteduzzo. I'd given him that nickname, and Santo would say, what's Marteduzzo up to these days? What's going on? What's happening? You know?
What's the translation of Marteduzzo?
A little hammer, because I gave him that name because he was always pounding away, and it reminded me of a little hammer pounding away.
My friends, and you are my friends since I'm a kid, 16 years old.
Hoffa was a working-class hero to his union, but he was a corrupt savings and loan to the mob. He controlled $1.4 billion, which had been set aside for the retirement of thousands of rank-and-file truck drivers. The mob wanted to borrow money from the pension fund for risky business ventures. When Trafficante wanted a Teamster loan for himself or a friend, Regano served as his broker, taking finder's fees for tens of thousands of dollars.
They can lull you to sleep.
In the early 1960s, Robert Kennedy came down hard on Jimmy Hoffa. 15 grand juries investigated the Teamsters on charges ranging from fraud to extortion to rigged elections.
This is Gestapo tactics as never practiced even by Hitler, Mussolini, or Khrushchev.
Hoffa was fed up. During a strategy meeting with his lawyers, he posed the question about Bobby Kennedy, who he had nicknamed Booby.
What do you think would happen if something happened to Booby? That's where he put it. And Bill Buffalino spoke up and said, that's easy. He says, John Kennedy would be so pissed off, he says, that he probably would appoint somebody could be worse than Bobby Kennedy. And then Jimmy asked, the next question was, well, what if something happens to John Kennedy? What do you think will happen? And Bill says, he said, you know, Lyndon Johnson hates Bobby as much as we do. And he'd kick his ass out, he'd get rid of him. And there'd be another attorney, there's no question about that, he'd get rid of him. And Jimmy said, well, it makes a lot of sense.
Apparently, this wasn't the first time Hoffa had talked about killing one of the Kennedys. A year earlier, he told Ed Parton, a corrupt Louisiana Teamster, that he wanted to kill Robert Kennedy.
In September of 1962, Ed Parton and Jimmy Hoffa were having a conversation at Teamster headquarters. During the conversation, Hoffa insisted that he wanted to kill Bobby Kennedy.
Before he died, Parton recounted Hoffa's plan for killing Kennedy. Moldea taped the conversation.
I want some plastic explosives. I want, when they go off, they'll burn it, goddamn. I have to burn all them some bitches up. And I said, you mean the kids too? He said, that's right. So they belong to that son bitch, don't they? I said, now wait just a goddamn minute. I said, I ain't gonna be no part of listening to nothing about kids being killed.
At Teamster headquarters in early 1963, Hoffa pulled Regano aside.
And he was ranting and raving for a while about this goddamn Kennedy, and everybody's going to go to jail, and they just have got to get rid of John Kennedy. Again, I think he used the word kill even, killed John Kennedy. And then he asked me when I was going to see my friend again, and he was referring to Santo. He never called him by name. And I told him I was planning on flying into New Orleans that evening, which I did.
Regano went to meet with Santo Trafficante and New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello. The two mobsters were uncommonly close. They shared a southern base, business ventures in Cuba, and alliances with the Teamsters. 2 years earlier, Marcello had been abruptly grabbed off the street and deported to Guatemala by the Justice Department. When he returned, his humiliation fueled his hatred for the Kennedys. Regano met the two men at the Royal Orleans Hotel.
I said, "You never guess what Marcello wants you to do." Santo said, "What?" And I said, "He wants you to kill the president." And they looked at one another, glanced at one another, and I got the distinct impression for a moment there that it was as if, well, that's what we were going to do anyhow.
A similar discussion had taken place 4 months earlier at a remote farmhouse outside of New Orleans. Las Vegas promoter Ed Becker says he was trying to get Marcello's help in a business deal when the talk turned to the Kennedys.
We were drinking, and so I just started to needle him about Bobby Kennedy, picking him up at outside that office and hustling him off to Guatemala in an airplane. Well, now he's really getting incensed. You know, I guess the scotch has loosened him up. His anger is very evident. He's not a happy man when you talk about the Kennedys. And he says, "Well, that's going to be taken care of," in words to that effect. And I says, "Jesus, you mean Bobby Kennedy, you know?" And then he said, "No, you don't do that."
Marcello implied that if Jack Kennedy were killed, Robert would be out of power.
But what it really came down to was he was talking about you cut off the head and the tail dies. And so right away I'm saying, well, woohoo, this is a different story. And I get the idea now, that he's really serious about it. He's drinking there, and it really frightened me, really did.
Could a president continue to serve as president if he were in prison?
There's nobody in prison. There's no need to make an answer to such a question.
By the fall of 1963, Robert Kennedy's Justice Department had produced results. Hoffa was under 2 indictments. Marcello was facing trial, and Trafficante was under investigation. But the war on organized crime would change dramatically on November 22nd.
Bulletin, Dallas. 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy motorcade today in downtown Dallas. The first reports say... Here it is, flash, Washington. Government sources here in the Capitol say President Kennedy is dead.
I went into the office, and my staff was in a state of hysteria. The radio was blaring, and their secretaries were crying, and as I passed the receptionist, she said to Mr. Hoffa's on the phone. So I went back to my office, and Jim was on the phone. And I said, "Hi, Jim." And he said, "Did you hear the good news? They shot the son of a bitch." They killed the son of a bitch. I knew how much he hated the Kennedys, but it was like perhaps the best day of his life. I mean, it was just, and in all candor, I must say it, I was terribly happy. My client's enemies became my enemies.
Trafficante also called Regano that day and suggested that he and Nancy meet him at the International Inn to celebrate.
And we went into the lounge, and we were toasting, and the assassination of the president, and he was beside himself. And he was
what was he saying?
We got rid of that goddamn Bobby Kennedy. Maybe they'll get off of Jimmy's back, and they'll get off of Carlos's back, get off our backs.
I think the only way that I can describe, I was horrified, absolutely horrified, hearing the two of them toast to that assassination. And I slammed my glass down, and I turned and I just fled. It was more than I could take.
Did a part of you want to leave with her? Or you
Oh, yes, of course, yes. I wanted to leave with her, but then I felt that Santa would think less of me, and I tried to put myself in his shoes, and he wouldn't have done that.
For a fleeting moment, that night before I stormed out, for a fleeting moment, I had a feeling that Santo had something to do with that.
While Nancy Regano was suspicious of Trafficante early on, Frank Regano says that he had no idea then that Trafficante might have been involved in a conspiracy to kill the president. Even now, he can't quite confront the consequences of his past. I was troubled by the power of his denial, so I pressed him about his sanitized portrayal of Santo Trafficante.
At that point in your life, did you have any guilt or shame or even doubt that you were putting your legal talents to the service of scum and people who were hurting society?
Well, in the first place, Santo and I had an understanding, a tacit understanding, that I would never ask questions.
But Frank, you now know that Santo had many people murdered. You now know he ran an organization that committed many crimes.
Of course, of course.
When you were in the middle of it, did you think about it? Did you feel anything about it?
It's difficult to answer, and the only way, my feelings at the time were that I was not, and perhaps I didn't want to believe it, but I was not aware of the fact that Santo, I didn't believe, as a matter of fact, that Santo was guilty of any violent crimes. I thought, if anything, he was engaged in white-collar crimes.
What if you had pressed him for details?
I wouldn't be sitting here, and you wouldn't be interviewing me at this time.
Well, how do you square that with knowing he would kill you, his beloved lawyer, with saying, well, he just was involved in white-collar crime?
I didn't think in those terms back then. I do now in retrospect. But in those days, I felt perfectly safe with him. And because of this understanding we had, he would only tell me what he wanted me to know. And I felt very comfortable with that arrangement. Of course, in retrospect, it was obviously wrong. And I think that it was due to the fact that I was extremely ambitious. And I, very frankly and candidly, enjoyed the publicity that it gave me. I became nationally known as a defense lawyer. And I have represented the so-called bad guys, but we often forget that the Bill of Rights was designed not only for the good guy, but for the bad guy as well. And when you protect... And the way I evaluated it at the time was representing Jimmy Hoffa, Santo Trafficante, or Carlos Marcelo, was tantamount to a corporate lawyer representing General Motors.
With a hostile new president in power and his brother gone, Robert Kennedy quit as Attorney General in 1964. Within 4 years, investigations of organized crime would drop by 75%. The FBI continued its surveillance of Santo Trafficante, but he was smarter than those who hunted him. Surveilled and tailed in Tampa, Miami, and New York, Trafficante would never spend another night in jail. FBI agent Jim Kenney investigated Trafficante for 15 years.
Our investigation of Santo Trafficante throughout the years proved to be frustrating in that he did maintain this low profile, and he was very, very circumspect about whom he would talk with, meet with, and it made it extremely difficult to develop sources of information who could get close to him and provide us with the probable cause to go further with our investigations.
In the fall of 1966, while mediating a mob dispute in New York, Trafficante was busted with other bosses and thrown in jail. Regano flew into town and got him out before the day was over. Several days later, Regano toasted his success along with Trafficante and Carlos Marcelo. This photograph flashed around the world and established Regano's reputation as an important mob lawyer. As successful as Trafficante was in his battles with the law, The opposite was true for Jimmy Hoffa. On March 7, 1967, he reported to the U.S. Marshal's office to begin serving 13 years for labor racketeering and jewelry tampering. Hoffa arranged for his close aide, Frank Fitzsimmons, to be elected president of the Teamsters. Part of the deal was that Fitzsimmons would try to get Hoffa out of jail.
And as those who made comments to him at the time said, hey, what are you picking him for? Must be 100 guys more qualified. And he says, yeah, but I can control him. And as he was reminded many times thereafter, if you can control him, so can somebody else.
And that's exactly what happened. The mob began dealing with Fitzsimmons, and Hoffa was abandoned in prison.
He was climbing walls. He was doing what we call bad time, what lawyers call bad time. And he'd been in prison at that point approximately 4 years.
In April of 1971, Hoffa was granted a 4-day humanitarian leave to see his ailing wife. He used the opportunity to set up a meeting with Fitzsimmons at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. Hoffa asked Regano to be present.
He said, Fitz, look me straight in the eyes. I'm going to say this one time and one time only. And so I listened very carefully. He says, if you don't get me out of prison before Christmas Day, you won't be around to celebrate New Year's. And at that point, he looked over at me and said, I still have friends on the outside. And that's when it finally dawned on me as to why my presence was required, that he was, in effect, telling Fitz that he still had muscle on the outside to carry out his threat.
How are you, sir? How are you feeling?
All right, fine.
Hoffa was released from prison on December 23, 1971, 2 days before his deadline.
Did you speak to Mr. Fitzsimmons since you've been out of prison?
I have spoken to Fitzsimmons, given him my best regards, and assured him that our friendship is as always has been and will stay that way.
This is purely a...
Regano says that Fitzsimmons had cut a deal with the Nixon administration on Hoffa's behalf.
I don't want to talk about that.
Was there a cash contribution involved in
Yes.
this transaction?
Yes, he told Nixon that they would make a healthy contribution. And in fact, Alan Dorfman made a contribution. What he told me was he delivered $1 million in cash, but I don't believe that. I think it was more like $100,000 or $200,000.
Who did he give it to?
John Mitchell, the Attorney General. And there's no question in my mind about that at all.
Fitzsimmons then cut his own deals with the White House. According to secret FBI memos I obtained, Nixon personally ordered Attorney General Richard Kleindienst to protect Fitzsimmons from criminal investigation. Kleindienst told me he doesn't recall the specifics, but according to the FBI documents, in March of 1973, the Justice Department turned down a request to extend the wiretap, which would pick up conversations between Fitzsimmons and the mob. Nixon put restrictions on Hoffa, preventing him from participating in any union activities for the next 10 years.
He said, fucking Frank Fitzsimmons, he says, he double-crossed me. He says he didn't get me out. And now that son of a bitch double-crossed me again. He says, you need to see Santa. We got to get rid of him. We just got to get rid of him. I want that son of a bitch. I want to kill that son of a bitch.
What do you think this court's going to do? What are you asking it to do?
We're asking it to set aside the 1980 restriction for preventing me from running for union office.
And are you doing
Frank Regano tried to console his friend, but Hoffa was irate. He was still fighting to get control of the Teamsters when he disappeared in 1975. Frank Regano was having his own problems. In 1976, he was convicted of tax evasion, given probation, and disbarred.
But when I totally became disillusioned with Santo, really became disillusioned with Santo, was when Santo came to me after Frank had been convicted. And he told me, he said, you're a nice woman. You have nice children. It's over for Frank. Pack up, leave, go back to your family. That was hard to take. That was hard to take.
Trafficante saw him now as no longer useful and turned his back on him, which is what these guys are all about. It's hard to believe it, but that's what they're about. The guy was no longer useful. Why bother with him? So Trafficante turned his back on him. And I think that was an act of betrayal that totally rearranged Regano's emotional life. I think it was something so extraordinary. He never believed it could happen. I mean, he had a lifetime with his wife, Nancy, saying, they're not real friends, they're not your real friends, they will betray you, they've done all, and he kept, oh, that's just Nancy, that's just Nancy. Well, in the end, he found out she was right.
Over the years, I felt that, that they were being unfair and placing him in the same category as the other so-called mob figures. I thought he was different. There came a time where I was, as I said, virtually destitute, and I was a very proud man, and Nancy was the one that finally convinced me that we had no other options, and I needed to go see him and about some financial assistance. And I went to see him, and he greeted me as he always did, kissed me on both cheeks, and put his arms around me, and I was about to ask him, he said, "Jay, you know, I love you like a brother." He hugged me again, put his arms around me. "Ask me anything you want." He says, "If you want some arms broken, some legs broken, you want to get rid of somebody." I said, "Santo." You know, and he said, "Just don't ask me for money." I said, "Santo, I don't want any arms broken or legs broken to get rid of it. I need money." "Jay, I can't help you." And that was it. And I was flabbergasted. And then finally dawned on me that he was no different than the rest of them. And they abandoned you. And I thought ours was a special relationship.
When Frank came back from that meeting and told me, you know, what Santo had said, I don't normally talk like this, but I have to say it. I just looked at Frank and I said, "That dirty son of a bitch."
I hadn't given that any thought.
Frank Regano was unable to work for 5 years until the courts finally reinstated his law license in 1981. When an ailing Santo Trafficante was indicted for racketeering in 1983, he realized Regano had become useful once again and asked him to help with the defense. He told Regano that he was afraid of dying in prison.
And I felt obliged to represent him, knowing that he would not represent me if the shoe was on the other foot. But I had to live with myself.
If I'd had my way, Frank would not have represented him. As far as I was concerned, this man meant nothing to me anymore. I hoped he hadn't meant anything to Frank. But there was something left that Frank had to do for him at that last trial.
In 1986, the two men showed up for their last legal battle together. A grateful Trafficante had a private conversation with his godson, Frank Regano's son, Chris. He offered to have the legs broken of anyone who was giving his godson trouble. For Santo Trafficante, violence was an expression of intimacy. In the end, the judge declared a mistrial, saying there wasn't enough evidence to proceed further, and Trafficante escaped jail one final time. A year later, Trafficante was dying. Facing heart surgery, he was unlikely to survive. He summoned Regano to his house for one last conversation.
And he just wanted to get some things, I suppose, off his chest, and what he was in effect doing was telling me about mistakes he'd made in his lifetime, and if he had how he would do things differently if he had his life to live over again. And that's how it got started.
For the first time in 30 years, Regano asked Trafficante a direct question.
It's the only time I asked him during those conversations we had for some hour and a half. The only time I asked him a question outside of legal proceedings. I asked him, I said, "What happened to Mark Teduzzo?" And he told me the story.
Who did Santo tell you killed Jimmy Hoffa?
Fitz and the mob.
Why?
They didn't want him back into the Teamsters. They were very comfortable with Fitz. He couldn't say no to requests for loans, And that's what Santo was telling me on his...
Could Santo have stopped the murder?
Yeah, and that's why he asked me not to say any questions. He said, yeah, he says, you know, he says, my hands were tied. He said, but I thought maybe, you know, you could have gotten word to Marteduzzo and maybe that wouldn't have happened. He says, I know how much you liked them, he says, but my hands were tied. And I was afraid that they knew I was telling you this, that I would have problems with my friends up north.
But the most startling revelation in this deathbed conversation concerned the assassination of President Kennedy and the involvement of Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans mob boss.
And he said that Carlos had fucked up, you know, and he got rid of Giovanni. He called John Kennedy Giovanni in Italian as John, as I knew he was referring to. And then they said that they should have gotten rid of Bobby instead.
Well, when he says Carlos fucked up, what does that mean?
That they should have killed Bobby instead of John Kennedy. That's a clear message to me. It's very clear to me.
Santo Trafficante died 4 days later. I have never been a conspiracy thinker or an assassination buff. I was with Robert Kennedy writing a biography when he was killed in 1968, and I've had an aversion to the subject ever since. But I needed to test Regano's credibility, so I went to the assassination archives in Washington, D.C. I was familiar with the general findings of the House Assassination Committee in 1979. It found, for example, that there was a conspiracy to kill the president, although the committee said it could not conclusively prove who was behind the conspiracy. But it did say that both Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello had the motive, means, and opportunity to assassinate President Kennedy. According to committee documents, Carlos Marcello had credible associations to Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald. There was also testimony that linked Trafficante to the assassination. A highly trusted FBI informant named Jose Aleman testified in secret session that Trafficante told him in September of 1962 that Kennedy was, quote, going to be hit, end quote.
Mr. Aleman, do you solemnly swear the evidence you're about to give this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you.
But when he went into public session, Aleman, who by now was in fear for his life, changed his story.
Prior to that, had you heard the expression, he's going to be hit, the term before? Are you familiar with that expression?
Well, it's going to be hit with a lot of votes from the Republicans or anything like that. I didn't have any idea at that moment. That's why I want to bring this to the committee.
In the end, the committee, in what it called its duty to be cautious and because of a lack of direct evidence, did not commit to the involvement by Trafficante or Marcello in the assassination. That was 13 years ago. To clear up the committee's ambiguous conclusion, I looked up the man who wrote the report, the chief counsel for the Assassinations Committee, Robert Blakey, the same man who worked for Robert Kennedy fighting organized crime in the early 60s. Blakey, who is now a professor of law at Notre Dame, has recently had extensive conversations with Frank Regano.
Do you believe that Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello had the intellectual and conceptual imagination to organize a successful conspiracy to murder the president?
I not only believe they did, I think it's most likely explanation of what happened.
Mr. Chairman,
Blakey says that there are 3 independent witnesses who support Regano's story. FBI informant Jose Aleman, who committed suicide in 1983. Mobster Johnny Rosselli, who implicated the mafia in conversations with journalist Jack Anderson. Rosselli was then murdered in 1976. And Ed Becker, who said Marcello planned to recruit a nut to kill the president.
Well, did he actually say that he was going to get a nut to do the assassination so it can't be traced to
yeah.
him?
Well, I said, geez, you know, that's right away they know it's you, Carlos. I mean, you've got everything going for you. You're the one that hates him. Everybody knows this, you know. There's no worry. You get a nut to do this thing and nobody's looking at you. Oh, okay.
So this deathbed revelation is not so much a revelation as it is a confirmation of what a substantial number of people have for some time believed to be the single most credible scenario of the assassination. I am more skeptical of the possibility that Hoffa was a third party in this assassination conspiracy, that he may have been knowledgeable about it, that he may have associated himself with it, and may have given consent to it occurring, all seems to me to be credible. That in some sense he was the origin of the plan, and that Marcello or Trafficante acted as instruments of Hoffa is something that I think is just simply not supported by the evidence, the weight of the evidence.
Well, do you still think that the number...
Frank Regano had said something else which interested me. He had attended the 1969 trial in New Orleans, where District Attorney Jim Garrison claimed that the CIA, not the mob, was behind the assassination. Regano got to know Garrison and went out drinking with him during the trial.
What is your view of the trial and Jim Garrison?
He was doing it to further his own political career. He had aspirations of running for the governorship. Carlos told me that he was his man. He spoke very highly of Carlos.
What was the context of Carlos Marcello telling you that Jim Garrison was his friend, and what did that mean?
That Garrison was really trying to protect the mob, that he wouldn't do anything to say anything derogatory about the so-called mob and Carlos.
If you want to say it, his investigation, the subtitle should be Anybody But Marcello. You want to ask yourself, could Carlos Marcello have influenced Garrison? And the answer is, not only could have, he was.
Mr. Chairman, the evidence we have just heard...
In 1979, while Blakey was finishing the Assassination Committee's report, the FBI launched a sting operation which ensnared Carlos Marcello. An undercover informant, wearing a hidden microphone, was recording hundreds of hours of conversations with Marcello. But Blakey was never allowed to hear these tapes.
Indeed, at one stage, an assistant director of the FBI told me that Carlos Marcello discussed the assassination on one of these tapes. And I just went ballistic. I said, I've got to see it, I've got to understand it. He said, no, I couldn't have it.
The FBI still has the tapes, but 2 months ago, Congress passed legislation which will eventually make public most of the assassination files, including the Marcello tapes. One more piece will then be added to the jigsaw puzzle we've been looking at for almost 30 years. There'll always be an element of mystery about November 22nd, 1963. But the pieces that Frank Regano has added make it all the more probable that the faces in the puzzle include Carlos Marcello, now 82, and Santo Trafficante. Frank Regano is retired now, working on a book about his life. Mob experts I talked to believe his story, and over the past 9 months, I couldn't catch him in a single lie. But he has his critics.
I feel that Frank Regano perhaps makes a number of self-serving statements, and I would like to have some independent, reliable sources to verify anything that Mr. Regano told me.
But it's not self-serving to acknowledge you might have been an accessory to the murder of the president. How is that self-serving?
Well, if you want to sell a book or a screenplay, I suppose it could be self-serving.
Frank Regano was convicted a second time of tax evasion and is now facing 3 years in prison. The son of immigrants, he was seduced and abandoned by the dark side of the American dream. Today, at 69, he lives with the belief that his own clients conspired to kill the President of the United States.
It's a terrible thing to have on your conscience that you were associated with people who brought about that tragedy. But there's not anything you can do about it. You just have, except have some restless and sleepless nights from time to time.
Right. Is your disclosure a kind of atonement?
I suppose we have to live with our conscience, and perhaps that helps me some, yes. But even more important, I think, is that the fact that we need to set the record straight and let the American public know what happened.